Okay, so moving on to the cognitive aspects of development in adolescence. Just checking back in with our buddy Piaget. Um, Piaget thought that maturation was an active process, right? So he thought development was about the children using assimilation and accommodation to make sense of the um, novel theories they were coming up with to understand and explain the world. By adolescence, Piaget had noted that students were thinking outside the box. They were able to think about hypotheticals, able to think about problems that they didn't have a concrete or physical example to work with. So in this way, children are seeking out information that matches what they can understand about their environments. So, according to Piaget, in adolescence, we're working with formal operations, and this stage is one of the main aspects of adolescence. It's about ways of thinking that are scientific and applying those scientific concepts to real life problems. One of the examples is the pendulum problem. So while this requires hypothetical deductive reasoning to consider all of the different variables that might affect how far the pendulum is going to swing in the opposite direction when she lets go of that string that you see her holding in the picture. Younger kids will generally take one aspect of the pendulum, the length of the string, the weight of the thing at the end of the string, the color, the size, whatever, but won't consider multiple things and won't be able to consider how to look at each of these variables independently. So adolescents are able to do some of this problem solving in their heads without actually dealing with or manipulating the pendulum itself, right? So they could think about it as a word problem. They could imagine it, where younger kids do better and ask for different kinds of solutions for the problem if they have it there to work with. Okay. Um, so there's also a lot of individual differences in how people use formal operations. Even in emerging adulthood and adulthood, a lot of people use formal operations inconsistently, and some not even at all. We tend to use it in areas of our lives where we are more practiced at using it. Um, Adolescents use it in math and science courses. In math and science, we tend to mentor kids in using and applying this way of thinking. So it's not so surprising that they're using it more in these topics, right, in these domains. Um, the other argument that people have made is that concrete operations, which is what we were able to do in elementary school, are generally good enough to arrive at a reliable solution in most kinds of problems. Um, that most kinds of problems do not require scientific method, deduction, hypothetical deduction, deductive reasoning. We also see some cultural biases in how people use these cognitive, the formal operations as Piaget described them. So um, it may be a universal potential to think in a scientific, hypothetical, deductive reasoning kind of way. Um, but a lot of other cultural issues matter. One is the kind of ways we think about thinking, so the epistemology of the particular place. In Western civilization, we tend to do a lot of if then statements, conditional statements, hypothetical statements, which get us used to thinking about hypothetical and reasonings about hypotheticals. So that gives folks who are used to thinking in those ways, used to thinking about if thens as a way of encountering or discovering knowledge, as that gives a leg up, right? In other places where it's more common to attribute wisdom and knowledge to sources of authority, religious authority, hierarchy, and political authority. Um, then it's not as, if then statements or hypothetical deductive reasoning is not as privileged. Um, so there's a lot of difference across cultural communities in how much people display this formal operational thought, um, depending across communities. One example um, is of a group in the Amazon, where people were not exposed to a lot of Western schooling or formal schooling. And the researchers went and told them this if then statement. They said, in the north, where it snows a lot, the bears are white. Um, Antioch is in the north, it snows a lot there. What color are the bears in Antioch? Right? This is an if then statement. If north, if snow, white bears. And then they give you Antioch is north, Antioch has snow, white bears, right? Um, the folks in this community that they had encountered who were not used to these kinds of question setups did not give that answer. They did not say the bears are white. They said things like, well, I haven't been there, so I don't know. Ask that other dude. He's been all over the place. He does a lot of traveling. He might know. Maybe you should ask the priest because he knows things, right? So they were not willing to hypothesize about this unknown. On the other hand, when given a more social and local kind of hypothetical situation, they were. So and so misses breakfast most days after he's been drinking. He was drinking a lot last night. Do you think we'll see him at breakfast? No, we won't because he was drinking last night. Right? This is also an if-then situation. One they were comfortable with answering, the other they were not. And so the reason I give this example is that in some cases, people are really used to applying this kind of way of thinking to lots of different aspects of their lives, to knowing this is a way of seeking knowledge and way of understanding the world, and in other cases, not at all. So whether you get to formal operations or not, it is affected by things like age, familiarity with the domain of the problem. You're more likely to use it in areas of thinking or problem solving that you are used to using it in. Schooling. So we have an empirical and a theoretical bias in schooling towards hypothetical deductive reasoning. You get a lot of coached practice, which is another thing on this list at school. So that is part of what helps you to do formal operations. If it is valued in your community, right? Schooling is a way that we show that formal scientific thinking, hypothetical deductive reasoning is valued in our communities because we teach it in school. And then the last one on here, we tend to do better with this kind of thinking in adolescence and throughout adulthood as well, if we are thinking in groups. If we have other people to check us, right, to work on checks and balances. For me, I always think of editors and publication when it gets to this. We need each other to kind of, you missed a step there. Oh, wait a second. What about this caveat? What about this compound, right? So we need each other to be working at our optimal formal operations level. Okay, so there's some other kind of fun things that we get with this type of reasoning. Adolescents tend to be more argumentative, and they have distorted images of the relationship between themselves and others. I'm going to introduce this here. We'll talk about it a little later in another lecture, the next piece as well. The imaginary audience which is where I think that everybody is paying attention to me and looking at me all the time. And then the personal fable. You can think about this as personal exceptionalism. It is different for me, right? I know that happens to most people, but that's not going to happen for me. Connected to optimistic bias, which we'll talk about as well. Adolescents tend to be very idealistic and very critical. We can think about how things ought to be and therefore that makes us critical of how things are, right? Also, adolescents are even better than they were at as younger kids in their planning and this ability to look and vision further out and imagine what things ought to, how things would go. Okay, so some of the also kind of fallout from these new ways of thinking is that adolescents start to reason about abstract principles. So an adolescent might say something like, we want to put in these laws or policies in place to ensure safety. That's a more abstract, larger principle rather than to prevent people from stealing or killing. They may be talking about or contributing to the similar kinds of things, but one is based on prohibiting specific behaviors, and the other is ensuring a larger abstract kind of concept, right? They also change their thinking about social control. So this relates to changes in morality, which we talked about a little bit last week, I believe. Um, excuse me. Where we're talking about how best to deal with people breaking laws or policies that are not quite meeting what their intended purpose. So an example, if I tell you that the speed limit on freeways in Southern California is 65, but most people are usually doing somewhere between 70 and 75 on the freeway, um, a younger kid would say, well, um, very law-based, good boy, good girl, even with the reciprocity thing. These ways of thinking about rules still very much holds the rule as that's the thing. It's not until adolescence that we start to see people say, well, so why would they have put that law in? Why 65? Why not 70? Are there dramatically greater fatalities at 70 miles an hour than there are at 65 miles an hour if people get into a crash? Are there more crashes if people drive faster? Right? What could be the reasons for this? And if the reasons aren't specific about a given um, mile per hour, then you might argue that 70 is more reasonable. These political ideals also may lead to adolescents or emerging adults even being our political revolutionaries, thinking about civil rights, environmentalism. This can be naive and problematic as well sometimes, but we also need those idealistic political views to kind of push us sometimes too. So thanks to adolescents and emerging adults for doing that. Okay, so Piaget's research has also brought up post-formal thinking, right? Because Piaget called this stage formal operations. And what we start to see in emerging adulthood, which we'll talk about in a later video, is more of the pragmatism and reflective judgment. So pragmatism, we're talking about applying logical thinking to real life situations. The application is really hard, even for adolescents. Even if they are able to walk through the logical, hypothetical, deductive reasoning, it's hard to apply that then to an example. So in the early 20s, we start to see adolescents that are able to understand practical limitations for logical thinking, right? One of the classics here that I always like is, okay, so you've got peanut butter and tomatoes and ham and mustard and jelly and onions. How many different kinds of sandwich can you make with 3 ingredients? How many different kinds of sandwich can you make with at least two ingredients, right? Well, this is a math problem essentially, right? How many combinations of 2 can you make out of all of those things? On the other hand, I don't want to eat peanut butter and onion sandwich. That sounds disgusting, right? So there's practical limitations to that same question, right? Tomato and onions and ham might be okay, but PB&J and that's it. I don't even want to try a tomato up in there, right? Just those two. So there's practical limitations that need to be taken into account for a lot of these problem solving things that adolescents are able to do. Young adults, emerging adults are better at involving the practical aspects. So reflective judgment, we're talking about the capacity to accurately and logically understand the evidence for arguments. So how good is an argument? How good is their evidence? This is good and part of what we do in formal operations, but it's not required, right? Formal operations is necessary to be able to do this, but formal operations are able to do. So this is dualistic thinking. I can think about something from one perspective, I can argue it one way and argue it another way. Imagining a debate scene maybe in my head. Multiple thinking, so thinking about it backwards and forwards in multiple ways. Relativism. Relativism, is there a right way? Maybe there is no answer that we can come to. So that is one way of handling. And then commitments. So understanding one's commitment to a specific idea or source of evidence. The information processing approach here, just a reminder of what's going on with information processing. We think of cognition and development as continuous, focusing on the processes of thinking for all ages. And the model for this is a computer. So the key parts here is attention, processing, and memory. So with that in mind, just another reminder of what's going on with the information processing. Talk about sensory memory, long-term memory, short-term memory, attention. So with this idea, our speed in adolescence is increasing. So we process faster. From age 10 through late teens, there's a dramatic increase in the speed of processing. And also this processing becomes more automatic, so less under my cognitive control, so it lowers my cognitive load. I don't have to think about it as much to do it. So adolescents show greater automaticity for processing than pre-adolescents, and automaticity depends more on experience than on age, so we are going to show more automaticity in the processing of things that we're used to thinking about, right? So that may account for some of why we do more formal operations and more formal operational thinking in dealing with things that we're familiar with. Okay, so we also start to see adolescents become more critical in their thinking, right? Remember I said they were more argumentative, they were critical of society, critical of common knowledge. So a wider range of knowledge is available to them. They also can consider different kinds of knowledge at the same time, compare and contrast. They're evaluating maybe a little bit of different sources of knowledge and evidence. And so they have lots more cognitive strategies at their available to them to apply or learn new things. The other thing to say about critical thinking is that we don't learn these automatically. Critical thinking is at least partially contingent on having some trained and guided experience trying to think critically. We don't tend to do much of this, unfortunately. In the American educational system, we tend to say, here's the right answer, remember that and repeat it back to me. As opposed to, here are some ideas that you might use to come up with or to deduce, right, what the right answer might be. Okay, so we're gonna stop it there and then we'll come back and talk about social development in adolescence.